I don't know if Pamela is even well enough to be on Zoom, but I wanted to start actually with a confession live for her, and she's not here. Last week in a conversation Pamela and I were having with somebody else, she referred to the Genesis series, and I think she meant this politely, that Paul's been doing this year. And I didn't think it had been that long. So I said, the series just began in March. It just felt longer. But then this week, while looking for something else in my files, I saw that indeed the first sermon in the series was in January. So welcome back to this year's series. There are only 2 sermons left in it, this week and next. And that's not because material is running out, but because the school year is, and we're going to be shifting gears for the summer. So as I often do, I'd like to start by backing up a bit and reviewing, and I'm going to back up quite a bit to last year, to October, when we were exploring the literature in the Bible around law and covenant. And I mentioned then that most of us, when we were growing up, heard things as children like, "Oh, we don't do that in this family." Or things like, "This is who we are. That is not who we are. In our family, we always do such and such." And that's how we, as children, were taught the cultures of our various families. But that's not limited to families, as I'm sure you know. It happens all the time on sports teams and in dance studios and in classrooms and staff meetings, in choirs, in churches, in municipalities, and in nations. And in fact, national identity was why we were talking about this sort of thing in October, because the law helped shape the national culture of the Israelites as they emerged from Egyptian slavery and slowly made their way to the Promised Land. And ancient Israelite national identity is what we're going to be talking about this morning also. Remember that it wasn't just the 10 Commandments that showed up at the base of Mount Sinai. In the Israelite story, through the person of Moses, the law and the covenant, which was an invitation to a relationship, and the worldview stories of early Genesis all arrived together. And they were all in the business of creating a radically new culture that aligned with the radically loving character of Yahweh. Or to put it another way, the ancient Israelites were invited by Yahweh to join a revolution, to avoid becoming yet another normal, hierarchical, violent, ancient Near Eastern civilization. We don't do that in this family, in this nation. That is just not who we are. So this morning, we're going to look at some of the ways that negative sounding message, "we don't do that," was communicated in early Genesis. It may feel a little bit like a hodgepodge of miscellaneous passages, but I hope you'll see that they hang together with that theme. So, early Genesis versus ancient Near Eastern civilization. Let's go. I've got 6 examples for you from the first 11 chapters of Genesis. 6 examples of early Genesis saying, don't be normal. Don't be like the rest of the ancient Near East. And we're going to go through them roughly in the order that they appear. So example 1 of 6. And this first one we've already talked about this year. But I just want to bring it back to your attention. It's the serpent in the Garden of Eden story. In previous sermons, we've talked about how the serpent was a common symbol of Pharaoh's power in Egypt, and therefore came to be a kind of shorthand symbol for Egypt and the overall Egyptian vibe. Centuries later, the serpent was also a common symbol for the Babylonian Empire and worldview. And just think back, what does the serpent, this symbol of normal ancient Near Eastern empire and power, what does this serpent do in the Eden story? Bring confusion, give bad advice, that when followed, sows division and breakdown in all the important relationships we have with each other, with the world, and with God. That's all the serpent does, just that. Serpent ruins everything. And it was, in addition to other things, a very powerful statement. Don't be like that, says the Eden story. Don't be normal. Join the revolution. That was a quick one. Example 2 of 6. You know about Cain and Abel. You know how Cain killed Abel out of jealousy. About how Cain, in his conversations with God, accepted absolutely no personal responsibility for his actions, and showed no concern for anyone other than himself. Well, right after that, there's a short genealogy that starts with that Cain and ends with a character named Lamech. And then we're told a little story about Lamech. Here it is. It's a bit strange. Lamech married 2 women, one named Adah and the other Zillah. Adah gave birth to Jabal, who was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal, who was the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. Do you play the pipes? You're out. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Do you know people who talk about themselves in the third person? They're annoying. Lamech is one of those people. Listen. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, says Lamech. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. The end. Strange story. What's going on here? Well, Lamech is acting and behaving very much like a normal ancient Near Eastern king. He marries multiple wives. They did that. He's part of a genealogy where people are credited with being the inventors of things to do with civilization. Agriculture and music and metalwork. Kings claimed this sort of thing in their ancestries. I did that. My ancestors did that. Lamech responds to a small hurt with a quick and violent overreaction, and then brags about it. Ancient Near Eastern kings did that, we know. But notice that Lamech, who basically represents the typical ancient Near Eastern king, is linked through a genealogy to Cain, who is one of the most unsavory characters in the Bible. All to say, ancient Near Eastern kings are like Cain. Don't be like that, Israelites. Don't be normal like that. Join the revolution. You might say, that sounds a little like propaganda. Yes. Example 3. Example 3 of 6. Just before the flood story that we all know through picture books in Sunday school and things like that, there is a lesser-known, strange little passage. It's only 4 verses long, but it might be one of the most perplexing passages in the Bible. And when you read through commentaries and things like that, any scholars worth their weight in respectability will tell you, basically, don't ask me. This passage is weird. They'll just admit it, but they usually use more academic language, but the meaning is the same. And here is that short passage. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, plural, the sons of God saw that these daughters were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with human beings forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years." The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of the human beings and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. Okay, it's weird. And there are all sorts of sort of scholarly guesses about what's going on here. There are also a lot of non-scholarly guesses about what's going on here. If you want to disappear into a kind of a weird black hole where you might just come out the other side with some kind of a virtual lobotomy, just follow some of the weird guesses anyway. But even with scholars, it's just sort of guesswork, and they'll tell you that. They'll admit that, because there isn't enough in the Bible or in other ancient literature to help us triangulate on what's going on here, which is often what you have to do to figure out what language means. You need more than one example of something. But one idea comes up a little more frequently than the others, and it is based on something that we do know about the ancient Near East, and so it's a place to start. Ancient Near Eastern kings, the normal ones, the ones that weren't Israelite, ancient Near Eastern kings called themselves sons of the gods. That's what they called themselves. They claimed to be descended from a god or the gods. And so when we hear the phrase sons of God in this passage, we could, because it can be done in other examples in literature, we could substitute kings with pretty good, there's pretty good support for that. So I'm going to read you the passage again, substituting kings for sons of God. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the kings saw that these daughters were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And we also know that this happened in the ancient Near East. Kings just took whoever they wanted to be among their multiple wives, sometimes even after the woman was married to someone else. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with human beings forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the kings went to the daughters of human beings and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown." And we also know that ancient Near Eastern kings often, usually through genealogies, associated themselves with the legendary warriors of the past. So if that's the right way to read it, then look what happens. The kings in this passage about the Nephilim, the kings are acting like normal ancient Near Eastern kings. They're doing whatever they want. They're taking whatever they want. And they're being credited with heroic violence. And making God sad enough to say in the very next verse, "All right, bring on the floodwaters." But in sadness, God is doing this, not in anger. Don't be like them, Israelites. What they are doing, those ancient Near Eastern kings, is bad. Join the revolution. Well, now we move to example 4 of 6. We're just steaming through. That passage from before the flood is weird. This next one is more understandable, but is also more bizarre. It would make a killer flannel graph. I'll just say that right now. Those of you who grew up with flannel graph in Sunday school. Okay, all right. Give it up for flannel graph, y'all. Also, this story is the only time we ever hear Noah speak. Through the entire flood story, we never hear Noah speak. We're just told, Noah did what the Lord commanded him. That's all. But Noah's speaking part there's only one, and it's in this story. You're about to hear it. Noah, after the flood, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay naked inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan. And remember that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his 2 brothers outside. But I can see a lot of you actually picturing the flannel graph right now. You should be listening to me right now. You do that kind of work later. Okay, but Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way, so they would not see their father's nakedness. When Noah, and I love this next phrase, it's one of my favorite little phrases in the Bible, awoke from his wine. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son Ham had done to him, Noah said, and here it is, his only speaking part, "Cursed be Canaan! The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." You heard me. Canaan. Not Ham, the son who actually saw Noah's nakedness. Canaan, Ham's son. Noah, in his only speaking part, curses his grandson for something his grandson did not do. Noah also said, I continue reading from Holy Scripture, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Noah lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. That's it. That's how Noah goes out, in a blaze of glory. So, Noah is the guy who got drunk. Just to kind of go through the facts here. Noah is the guy who passed out. Noah is the guy who left himself exposed. His son Ham just discovers the situation. But when Noah wakes up, probably to a horrific hangover, Noah just blasts away at the grandson. And I want you to just kind of hold this confusing weirdness in your heads as we move right along to the genealogy that comes immediately next in Genesis. Immediately next, there's a genealogy that's a different kind of genealogy, and I think that this bizarre story we just heard and the genealogy are intended to be linked to work together. So let's keep going. This genealogy is often called the table of nations, because it isn't like the other genealogies that just go boom, boom, boom through the generations. So-and-so was the father of so-and-so was the father of so-and-so. That's a usual genealogy. This one lingers in each generation and spreads out and lists lots of people, but not just people, which is kind of weird. Also nations and people groups, and sometimes cities. Imagine if your genealogy had a city in it. It starts by naming the 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham, you'll remember, is the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad son. And as we read through the genealogy, we notice we're told all the descendants of Shem and all the descendants of Japheth, and we're also told all the descendants of Ham. We notice that the descendants of Ham, the horrible son, in his list of descendants are some really familiar sounding names. From Ham, in the genealogy, from Ham come the cities of Nineveh, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Canaanites, the Philistines, and the empires of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. In other words, all the enemies the Israelites had, all under Ham in the genealogy. Ham, the dirty, yucky son. And then you realize, hey, wait a minute. This gross story about Noah, combined with the Table of Nations, it's political propaganda. And the answer is yes. That is what it is. We don't do it that way today. Can you imagine? Don't vote for Lisa Helps. She accidentally walked in on an awkward situation once. She wouldn't quite have the punch. But that's what it was then. It was political propaganda. And in the ancient Near East, this is strange to us because we have become, and I'm not using this term lightly, but we have an ancient Near Eastern person looking at how we make genealogies would ask, does the entire culture have OCD? Why are they so particular about listing everybody in order? Because they just didn't do that. For them, genealogies told stories. And sometimes for them, genealogies were about politics and not about biology. They were about who is close to us in terms of political and social connection, not who is related to us in terms of chromosomes. So it isn't subtle, and it's certainly not the way we use genealogies, but remember, early Genesis isn't modern. So if it doesn't match our modern use of genealogies, that's okay. And there was an important point being made here, because throughout Israelite history, the empires of Egypt and Babylon and Assyria really seemed unstoppable. The cultures and the armies of the Canaanites and the Philistines seemed firmly established, and the cities of Nineveh and Sodom and Gomorrah were important and negatively influential power centers. But don't be like them, screams this Noah story combined with the Table of Nations. Those normal ancient Near Eastern civilizations may look powerful and important and unshakable and unstoppable, but ultimately, Israelites, the way they live life is dirty and gross. We don't do that in this family. We don't do that in this nation. Resist. Join the revolution. Example 5 of 6. As long as we're talking about genealogies, it's time to stop and talk about the shocking lifespans that we find in some of these genealogies. Before we talk about it, just some background information. It was typical in ancient Near Eastern literature. We now know this. It's as a result of discoveries really in just the last maybe 150 years. We now know that it was typical in ancient Near Eastern literature to have a genealogy with really big lifespans leading into a flood story. And then you have the flood story, and then you have another genealogy coming out of the flood story with much shorter lifespans. There is a Sumerian example where there's a 10-generation king list from kind of like the legendary prehistorical times with ridiculous lifespans. And then there's a flood story. And then there's another 10-generation king list that leads up to modern times, modern for them, with more normal lifespans. This was a thing. And what do we find in Genesis, which was written long after this Sumerian king list? We find a 10-generation genealogy from prehistoric times with really long lifespans. Then we find the flood story. And then after the flood story, another 10-generation genealogy leading up to modern times, which for them was Abraham. So as I say, it was a known literary form to link these things together this way. Now, we 21st century readers are shocked by the lifespans we see in the first Genesis genealogy, those 10 generations leading up to the flood story. We read about people living into their 700s, into their 800s, even into their 900s. After the flood, in the second genealogy, the second 10-generation genealogy, the lifespans become more normal as you go, shrinking down into the 100s as we get closer to Abraham and the start of what for them was the modern era, the Israelite story. Okay, those lifespans in the first one, the 700s, 800s, 900s, they were designed to be shocking. I'm just going to tell you that now. The ancient Israelites would have been shocked by them as we are. 700s, 800s, 900s. But, and here's a beautiful plot twist. The ancient Israelites would have been shocked for the opposite reason that we are. Because It's not what they were expecting. In the first Genesis 10-generation genealogy, the average lifespan is around 850 years. But in the Sumerian king list I told you about, the average lifespan in that first 10-generation king list that leads into the flood story, the average lifespan is about 30,000 years. So normal would have been to hear something like 30,000. We think 850 years, that's so long. But the ancient Israelites would have heard it and thought, only 850? That's pathetic. Compared to what was typical in ancient Near Eastern literature. And what is the point then? What's the point being made by these pathetically short lifespans? Well, again, in the normal ancient Near Eastern world, kings claimed to be descended from the gods, tracing their lineage back to the legendary era. And that's what justified the godlike powers that kings claimed for themselves. That's what explained their aggressive personalities and their violent behavior. The 30-year lifespan thing were just ways of saying godlike, practically immortal. So ancient Near Eastern kings could tell you that they descended from people who were practically immortal. Therefore, they had the right to behave as they were behaving. But in Genesis, that 850 business is kind of like a nod to the longer numbers, but it's shockingly small. It's very disappointing. If you're aiming for immortality, like if 30,000 is an option, 850, yeah, well, okay. In Genesis, no genealogy goes back to gods. Nothing goes back to practically immortal. In Genesis, the genealogy goes back, if you want to trace it all the way back, to Adam. We usually say Adam, but Adam, which in Hebrew just means earthling. In the normal ancient Near East, the kings, the very few at the top of the hierarchy, trace their lineage back to immortality, and they use that to exert violent power. In Genesis, no matter how far back you go, you just get Adam, and then after that, before that, dirt. That's it. And this is really, really important. Genesis is proclaiming here, and we need work, we need help from people who have entered into the ancient Near Eastern culture and literature and can understand these things. And thanks to the work of these scholars, which is probably day-to-day not very exciting work, but thanks to this work, we can now see Genesis is proclaiming with these numbers and with dirt and with earthling, proclaiming that nobody should set himself up, and I'm saying himself because these were kings we're talking about, nobody should set himself up like a normal ancient Near Eastern king. Nobody should claim to be godlike in that way, exercising violent power over others. Because ultimately, says Genesis, we are all fellow earthlings, all of us. And we should treat each other that way. We are equal. Don't be normal, Israelites. Do not subscribe to a system that institutionalizes violence. Fight the system. Join the revolution. And now, our final example of the 6. This one even comes with a picture. Our final example is the so-called Tower of Babel story. I'm saying so-called in a grumpy manner, because despite that traditional name and despite the heading that's so helpfully put by many Bible publishers in the text, the Genesis text itself never calls it the Tower of Babel story, and in fact, the tower isn't the focus. It's what we focus on, but it's not the focus of the story. I'm going to prove that. In my last sermon on the flood, we looked briefly at the structure of the Babel story, and here it is. And you know, Ben Lubert tells me over and over again, Paul, you make a visual and the screen doesn't go all the way to the edge. So you can see I thought it was just top and bottom, but I'm missing something on the right there, and I apologize. But anyway, as I said in that sermon, and I know that the text is small, and that's because that's the only way it could all fit on one picture. The story is structured symmetrically, top to bottom, to focus the ancient listener's attention on the center, on what is literally the central point. This is now called by scholars a chiastic story, after the Greek letter chi, which looks like X. So the top matches the very bottom. The second from the top matches the second from the bottom until it's all focused on the center. That's the idea here. Let's read through it with commentary. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. You know, Shinar? And we don't know. And frustratingly, Shinar is just another Hebrew name for Babylonia, which is that region where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are kind of closer together, modern-day Iraq. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." More than just a goofy-sounding sentence, this refers to mud bricks that are kiln-fired rather than just sun-dried. Different places use different techniques. This is the technique of kiln-firing bricks. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. And this just confirms that we are, in fact, in Babylonia in the setting of this story, because those are the building materials and methods used there, as opposed to other methods in the Promised Land. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." And now we come to it. What is the building project? Come, let us build ourselves a, say it, city with a tower. And now look all the way down at the bottom of the story, second to last sentence. So they stopped building the city. You're murmuring. You're reluctantly murmuring. It is a city that they're building. This really should be called the City of Babel story, not the Tower of Babel story. And this city has what every major Babylonian city had: a tower, a ziggurat, actually. If you can remember what a ziggurat looked like, you probably made one in Social Studies 7 or something. Babylonian cities had at their center three things: the king's palace, the god's temple, and a ziggurat. And at the top of the ziggurat was a kind of holy rest stop. It had things in it that the gods would like: sacrifices, food, drink, sometimes nicely made beds. And the purpose of the ziggurat was to attract a god, to trick a god into coming down and noticing the city. Why did the Babylonians do this? Because, as we've explored, they believed the gods were generally unconcerned about human affairs. The gods were self-absorbed, self-centered. Notice what this means. Ancient Babylonian architecture and ancient Babylonian city planning were shaped by ancient Babylonian theology. Babylonians built cities with ziggurats to make a name for themselves with the gods. Not to make a name for themselves that other people would notice, so that the gods would notice. Otherwise, the gods wouldn't notice or care. That's why it's so important that it reaches to the heavens to capture the attention of the gods. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people were building. And here it is, literally and also sort of conceptually, the central point. Yahweh does not need to be tricked into caring. They hadn't finished anything, and Yahweh was there. Yahweh already cares. Yahweh already sees. Yahweh is already interested. This is the main point of this story, of the City of Babel story. Let's keep reading. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. This often rubs us the wrong way, like God is against human accomplishment. But nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them really means nothing they plan to do will be morally and spiritually impossible for them. If they're doing this, then they're confused. There's spiritual confusion here. So God says, come, let us go down and confuse their language to match their spiritual confusion, so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why the city, was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. And that ending, my friends, was a joke that we don't get, because it's a pun that only works in Hebrew. Babel sounds like the Hebrew word for confused. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord babbled the language of the whole world. Right, that's the joke. So, but notice what's going on here. Babylonia, land of the confused. Babylonians, confused people. So once again, we have a story where the point is, we don't do that here. So ancient Israelites, every time you hear different languages, remember, we don't build cities or anything else based on the premise that God doesn't care about us. We don't need to trick God into caring. That's confusion. God already cares. God already sees. God is already interested. So don't be normal, because they're confused. Join the revolution. So those are the 6 examples, and I know they seem like kind of a hodgepodge. It would be a strange playlist if you were to put those 6 things together. But they are held together by a common call to revolt. There are 2 major ways that early Genesis helped to start a revolution and to shape a radically new kind of nation and new kind of people. One, the main way, was to offer positive visions about God, the world, and humanity. Most of this series this year has been about those positive visions. We've seen those positive things in the creation stories, plural, in the Cain and Abel story, in the flood story. But in a messy world, the real world we live in, when we want to shape culture, sometimes we also have to be negative. Sometimes we just have to say, we don't do that. That's not who we are. And early Genesis had to do that negative work too, as we've seen this morning. But let's end by remembering that this negative message, we don't do that here, was always in the service of a larger, more important, positive message. So here is a concluding summary. Don't be normal, Israelites. Don't think like the ancient Near Eastern people you see all around you. Don't think Yahweh is self-centered, self-absorbed, distant, uncaring, callously violent. Do not think freedom means the right to do whatever you want or take whatever you want from your neighbor. Do not think that there are some among you who have the right to treat other people like things, to be violently oppressive. And don't assume that the ancient Near Eastern worldview you see all around you is inevitable and unstoppable. We don't do those things. We don't think that way. That is just not who we are, because of the good news that is proclaimed throughout the rest of early Genesis, which is God is a loving, caring, loyal provider of good things. The world is a gift. All people, all of them, all of us, are made in the image of God. all should have the freedom to flourish. That is who we are. So join the revolution.